Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending the second of our Australasian Fluid Mechanics seminar series. Today I'd like to, before I introduce today's speaker, could I just request that everyone please make sure that your microphone and your camera are off, just to avoid any interruptions and to make sure that the connection's okay. We're going to allow you to ask questions during the seminar. If you'd like to ask a question, please either send us a message through chat or raise your hand. You can do this by going to the bottom of the Zoom, clicking on participants, and you should be able to see a raise hand there. So today's speaker is Gareth Vio from the University of Sydney. He did his Bachelor's of Engineering and his PhD at the University of Manchester. He also did a postdoctoral work at University of Manchester and University of Liverpool. And he joined University of Sydney as a lecturer in 2010 and has become a senior lecturer in 2016. And his research interests are aeroelasticity, topology optimization, multidisciplinary design, and shockwave boundary layer interaction. And today he's going to be talking to us about some fluid structure interaction. So thank you very much for agreeing to give a seminar for us.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'll just try and share the screen. And I practiced before, so hopefully it will work. Can you see the orange?
Yep, we've got your screen.
Okay. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to give a talk. As I said, I'm Gareth. I'm from the University of Sydney, and I suspect in some way potentially this presentation is a little bit more unusual for the society, and I will go through some of the kind of things that I actually look into that are mostly all related to fluid structure interaction problems in different kind of aspect as related to an aircraft. So, how do I, next slide. Okay, so I'll start to kind of with a little bit of what drove me to aeroelasticity and some of the problems in a way that I'm looking into, and it's driving my research. And then I'll present some of the work we've done on transonic buffet and the application of radial basis function to computational aeroelasticity, followed by some very brief introduction to some of the cavity work we started doing only recently, and then looking at some of the problems of topology optimization in a fluid structure interaction environment. So, if you're not familiar, aeroelasticity, computational fluid dynamics, computational structural dynamic, or fluid structure interaction in many ways are the same thing, but depending on who you talk to, they will use a different wording. Now, coming from a structural background, vibration background, aeroelasticity is the most common term, and the things we're interested is when wings will fly away from your body and upset your travel plan. And the video you saw was an experiment done here at Sydney quite a long time ago now. And that's a very simple wing, and you can easily model that in a linear environment, and you can actually get some very good and very accurate answers by just using simple panel methods coupled with a simple structural solver. Unfortunately, nowadays, aircraft like to be more complicated. And if you haven't seen this video of the F-117, you saw, just replay it briefly. If you look at the left-hand wing, you see that the elevator just does a quick oscillation and then tear itself apart. And these kind of problems are becoming more and more common. And that was simply due by the mechanic on the ground forgetting to tighten the nuts and bolts on that elevator during the last maintenance. and it led to the complete loss of the airframe. So how do you predict and how do you model those kind of problems? Those are the things that drove a lot of my early research. And what it kind of came further along is this kind of type of problem. So this is an F-16, and it's quite common that when you've got a nice slender wing and you put a nice mass at the tip, it just oscillates away. And it becomes completely useless as a military aircraft because you cannot get a lock-in with that missile. And it's also extremely uncomfortable for the pilot. If you were to see the video or just looking at the pilot, his head is actually shaking from side to side against the canopy. And this is a problem. And we're trying to model these problems and understanding how they actually happen. And on the right-hand side, you've got this graph of Mach number and response amplitude. And in there, if you look at flight test 1, flight test 2, and flight test 3, those are the same flight condition for the same aircraft under the same conditions on 3 different days. And you can see that you get completely different answers. And at the time, this graph now it's a little bit old, so we are doing a little bit better nowadays, but we still can capture the complete diversity of it. You can see the computational prediction that we could do around 15 years ago, and you can see it doesn't match absolutely anything. And there's a lot of work that nowadays has been done in trying to make more kind of stochastic rather than deterministic application of a lot of this theory to try and grab those elements to try and actually find out when this limit cycle oscillation actually occur. And if you look at that flight test 3, it only has 3 test points. That's because they were afraid of losing the airframe if they carried on going up with the Mach number. So this is kind of the problems that some of us in the aeroelasticity field kind of try to understand and are working to try and improve the modeling and to predict this type of behavior. And why we do this is, like you see from this picture of the B-52, if you get them wrong, you lose quite big chunks of your airframe that then is quite costly. So there's a lot of work that then has to go into managing the loads and as a consequence, the actual fatigue life of all your platform. And especially here in Australia is quite a big driver of the research in this area. So to start off, I'll start talking about Buffel. So I'll show you a video in a second of Buffel, but basically it's a nice autonomous oscillation of a shock over an aerofoil. And depending on the type of aerofoil, you can have quite different behavior in there. And the most common behavior is probably a type A or type AC type of behavior, and I'll just show you more in a second what I mean with that. But you can see that in this graph, we've got the 0815 aerofoil and the NACA 0012, which are relatively thick aerofoil. The 08 is a supercritical aerofoil, while the NACA 64 is a very thin aerofoil profile, more commonly associated with a fighter aircraft. But you can see that most of the envelope is dictated by a type A shock motion, which is just a nice sinusoidal shock oscillation over the top surface of your aerofoil. There is some parts of the flight envelope dictated by the red dot where we've got a type AC, which is a shock motion where as the shock moves upstream, it actually propagates into the free stream and disappears, and then as the cycle kind of moves along, it slowly reappears over the upper surface and it grows in strength as it moves downstream, and then it restarts the cycle. And we also have this high incidence shock buffet, and we'll talk about that in a second. If we go to the thin aerofoil, it actually has quite much more complex behavior, where we have also some the MIS type of behavior, which stands for medium incidence stall. So that's not a shock behavior, but we kind of put it there because this bimodal behavior is now a mix between the type A and the MIS behavior. So we'll go through now some of the videos so you can actually visually see what it actually means, what a type A, type C actually shock does. So you can see that here the shock, it moves, it has a little bit of a sub-period there that is partially dictated by the root of the lambda. Shock as a subharmonic in there, but the shock is present more or less for the entirety of the cycle motion. We then have a high incidence separate shock buffet, where when I play it, you will see that we have kind of a part of the cycle. There is a shock that is just very small around the leading edge of the aerofoil. This is on the NACA 0012. And you can actually see that we've got the standard kind of von Karman vortex shedding from the trailing edge and the Kevin Helmholtz from the top surface, from the leading edge that it travels downstream. The third is the moderate incidence stall. So as I mentioned, this is not Buffet, but again, it has similar characteristics to the high incidence, where we got a Kevin Helmholtz and a von Karman type of shedding behavior appearing. And we are interested in this type of behavior because we have this then fourth type of motion that we've characterized of bimodal oscillation, where we've got a type A shock appearing over the cycle that we can see it appearing now. The shock, so this is the part of the cycle from the type A Buffet occurring, and has this one then slowly move upstream. It moves into the Kevin Helmholtz and von Karman type of instability occurring on the aerofoil with no shock. So you can find all this rigma of behaviors over an aerofoil, and is not trivial to be able to model it. So there are some experimental, but we certainly need a lot more to be able to make sure that we are characterizing and modeling correctly all this type of oscillation, and that they're potentially not just a numerical aberration. Now, all these type of behavior, we like to look at them kind of more as well from a structural dynamics type of background. So we look at the kind of model decomposition and look how they actually behave. Now, the type AC motion, if you remember, is where the shock moves upstream and propagates up into the free stream, and then it slowly reappears over the aerofoil, is characterized by this kind of reduction towards the leading edge on the phase gradient. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. It's something that has been noticing to occur during the cycle in this particular type of Buffet behavior. Now, if we look at the high incidence shock Buffet, we can see that there is here basically the energy of each individual mode. So obviously is left and right is kind of the complex behavior, so the images of each other. And we've got this blue dot that superimposes the black dot corresponding to the type A and the HISP type of behavior, where it kind of corresponds to your bulk flow motion, so your free stream. And we can see that for the type A, we've got a very dominant first mode that corresponds to your standard sinusoidal oscillation. And the rest of the modes have considerably less energy, so they won't have a lot of interference with the actual dominant motion dictated by this mode over here. If we look at the HISP type of behavior, this is the dominant mode. We have to look at which one is the first dot in terms of energy. And this is the dominant mode for this type of behavior, which is dictated by the large-scale oscillation from the leading edge. And around here, we've got some subharmonics related to that, but you can see that then all the other modes related to this flow are more or less on the same energy level, but there is definitely a dominant mode in this particular flow field. Now, if we look at in the same way at one of the modes, and here for the stalled flow, we put kind of one of the high frequency modes that are kind of more up to the reduced frequency, up in the 10 and above. You can see that, but even the lower frequency will be very similar behaved, so that there isn't any more quite a dominant structure there with a fundamental mode that dictates the flow field. And we can see that then in the modal decomposition of the bimodal behavior, where we've got, again, comparison with type A, where we've got a dominant mode dictating the behavior, which is the black dots. And the bimodal, because is two types of distinct motions, where we've got buffet and stalled behavior. We can see that where we go buffet, it follows very much the same trend as the type A, as you would expect. The dominant mode has slightly more energy, and then it kind of trails off. While the stalled part, it doesn't have any more a dominant mode. There is possibly this one, but overall the energy spread is much tighter coupled than in the HISP type of motion, and where it basically shows that we get this type of behavior of very high frequency modes that are not easily distinguished between each other. Now, so that all those responses were kind of from a rigid aerofoil, so just stationary in the flow. Now, what happens? A real aircraft obviously moves in flight, so what happens when that aerofoil actually starts to oscillate? So if we drive the response, even here we can get quite a different type of behavior occurring in your response, and we can see generally around 5 different regions in our response, where we can look at kind of this region 1 and 2. So region 1, the driving frequency. So this is the spring stiffness of our aerofoil and the oscillation, the amplitude of oscillation. And this one is, so we've still got our pitch stiffness, and we've got the frequency, the dominant frequency of the response. And as we go from in region 2, the two starts to lock onto each other. So we start getting an increase in amplitude. You could almost think as if it was a resonance, but this is not a resonant type of behavior in the common sense that we would know as resonance. And as we go into region 3, we get a complete lock-in of the behavior. And then as we start moving away, there is a shift away and a changing phase, and we move away, and then we go back to very low scale oscillations of our aerofoil. And but with all this, you can then actually look at the dynamical behavior as with the different angles of attack and the Mach number and how these behave. And you can see kind of a standard Hoff bifurcation, and all these are driven by the nonlinearity is obviously driven by the aerodynamics. We've got a standard Hoff bifurcation that occurs as we go closer into the lock-in region, and we've got a secondary Hoff that comes into kind of a more aperiodic type of behavior, and a third kind of destructive Hoff occurring before completely disappearing at the higher angles of attack. But if we look at it in a Mach number sense, and this becomes closer to that initial video I showed of that F-16 with the missile oscillating, we can see that we get this, what is known more as an atypical kind of limit cycle, where at a certain point we got quite a big jump and appearance of the limit cycle that then as well slowly dies away, but before it has just a very small type of oscillation. And this is potentially then starting to give us an understanding that that behavior is that aircraft is actually experiencing some form of buffet behavior that gets coupled as well with the structural or having a tip mass, because the change in that tip mass will alter quite dramatically the behavior of the system. Now, we look at then as well at this type of behavior using some form of stability analysis. In this case, we use the higher order dynamic mode decomposition by looking at how the behavior changes so that we can distinguish between the fluids mode and the structural modes of our system. And you can see that going between the different regions, we get quite a different type of behavior. Especially if you look at the damping here of the system, we can see that the fluid modes are just almost just purely oscillatory sinusoidals with the stable structural modes. But as we go into the locking region, the structural modes are actually unstable, with the fluid modes providing the actual stability to the system, so the two will actually be out of phase. And as we go away from the locking region, they just kind of die away and become just back to a pure oscillatory driven signal. Now, all this buffet does occur on your standard civilian aircraft, which is not the good news. And normally the flight computer just knows not to fly in that particular region. But is there a way of actually stopping buffet? So if you look at the video on the left-hand side, you can see, if I just, once you restart, you will see in this region over here that we're slightly modifying the aerofoil. We're introducing a bump that moves into the free stream, and that you can see it actually completely stops and quenches the buffet. And this works quite well throughout the entirety of the flight envelope. So in this blue region of the flight envelope, we can actually stop a buffet, but in some region we're actually making it worse or actually introducing buffet. So it's not a complete solution, but it's something that can be investigated by, in a real world, by deploying a spoiler of some sort during flight. You will be able then to fly into this particular region. The efficacy of these bumps also depend very much on its location. And normally its best position is at the shock, at the foot of the shock of your normal shock. And the main thing that it does, it actually separates the communication between the shock and the trailing edge, so that there aren't any more waves that are being propagated downstream to cause this oscillatory behavior. Okay, so that completes, if you want, the part on buffet. So some of the other work we've been doing is how do we use kind of large-scale CFD to be able to do this type of simulations? But we want to be able to do it efficiently. And I'm sure probably a lot of you know my colleague Ben Thornberg that has an LES, a compressible LES solver, and we wanted to use that one to be able to make it into fluid structure interaction, or how we would call it as computational fluid dynamic, computational structural dynamic solver. And we wanted to use radial basis function. And there are two main reasons for using that. Is because a lot of the computation can be done up front. So a lot of the costing of doing all the transformations between the structure and the fluids can be done at the start of the simulation, and you don't need to compute anything beyond that. So all we want to do is just basically fit a curve where that curve will be a sum of radial symmetric function. And if you write that in full for your structural system, you can basically write it as a simple set of linear equation where you can find what is the weighting required for the curve fitting, which is your vector of A's. And so your CSS matrix can be pre-calculated before the start of the solution. And the same can be done then for the volume nodes. So during the deformation, you can actually deform the mesh for free as well from this computation. And it just becomes a simple least square solution to apply this problem. Now, there are some complications to it, that the structural matrix is hard to invert because there is no guarantee that it's sparse, and there is no a priori information to the sparsity of the matrix. And to solve that problem, you really want to try and reduce the dimensionality of that matrix. There's really no other way that can probably be done. And so it really takes, you need to look at carefully at setting the radius of the basis function. The other problem is that the coupled matrix between the solid and the fluids can be very large, because that is potentially as large as your fluid domain. And so there are obviously storage and computational issues. But what we've done is thinking, how can we do this in a parallel form? And so if you look at your domain, so your fluid domains is your square boxes, and we've got our structure with the dots in red. You can decompose that fluid domain in its basic components, and this is very targeted to a structured mesh, so that you can actually then simply apply that matrix locally to that particular block of the domain. And that domain can then potentially be reduced further and further and further into subdomains where there are some influence from nearby domains, but it means that the size of your matrix is now being split down to the size of your domain. We can still be big, but you won't expect, if the structure moves, probably this domain won't move. So there are saves that can be done in how it gets applied. And so one of the students coded all this in, and we applied it to the square Turek model. So we've got a rigid square cylinder with an incoming flow field and a flexible membrane behind. Obviously, the square field will generate a nice vortex shedding structure that will incite the membrane to oscillate. And we get very good results in terms of frequency and the displacement, showing that our approach works. Now, this is the original response from the people that did the original test on this, where they've got full dynamics. We just applied a single mode, and we just hit it instead of just waiting for the transient, hence why there is that difference at the start. But what we did, more importantly, is applied it to kind of a more large-scale problems. So we applied it to a store in a square cavity, because we were working in conjunction at the time with a lady called Katia Kasper from the Sandia labs in the US, to try and see whether we could model and then look at the spectrum from the response. And you can see on the bottom right how the structure is actually oscillating inside this flow field, and this one is for a flow at for a free stream flow of Mach 0.8. And when we compare the result with the experiment, as well with a rigid structure and a flexible structure, now the motion of the structure is very, very small, so can't see a lot of difference in this case. whether this is a structural mode that pops up, it would require probably a lot more time step to actually dictate whether that's true or not. But it's certainly providing an information that there is quite a change in energy in the structure of the main dominant fluid frequencies inside there. And these will have quite an effect into the fatigue calculation of any structure. So from that work, I carried on and I started looking kind of at the low speed cavity flows, mostly because our wind tunnel, it's a low speed wind tunnel. So we were running kind of some of the simulation. Obviously the image you see is still a computational solution that we run, and we're starting to look at more and more complex cases. And one of the cases we'll be looking in a second, some of the results that I just got a couple of days ago. You can see that here I've actually half closed the cavity. So you can see that the vortex that gets shed at the leading edge of the cavity gets broken up by this wall. And so what happens if you actually make this wall very flexible? Because that is the case on a real aircraft where the landing gear doors will actually flex, and these have to be replaced quite regularly because they fatigue, and so they cost a lot of money to the airlines. And this is, if you want, an image of the setup we've got for a wind tunnel, and we can change the length at the depth of the cavity. And this is kind of in a way just to show you that we can change, as I said, the depth and length of the cavity, and we can see quite clearly the change in the type of waves that are occurring inside this type of cavity. So the deeper cavity will have a much more of an up and down wave motion, while the longer cavity will just be a kind of more of a translational wave moving up and down the length of the cavity. And as I was mentioning, this having a flexible plate in the cavity, so here we've got the cavity mesh and the flow is coming upstream, and the plate is located here, and this end is actually fixed. And here is the response we can see from one of the tip of the actual plate. And if we look at the actual then frequency spectrum here, we've got the modes, kind of the structural modes, but then we've got quite a nice alignment then with the actual frequency mode. And in this case, they've been shifted from probably around the 10 Hertz from what we were getting from the pure rigid case. So there is quite an effect in the pressure that we will also get at the end from the simulation that I need to do that analysis going forward. Okay, so what I'm going to talk now is probably a little bit more of the oddball part, which is kind of topology optimization. So you're seeing the video of what topology optimization is. So topology optimization, you start with a domain, a predefined domain, and you're slowly removing or adding bits and pieces away until you end up with a structure that is compliant to whatever constraints you want. In this case, there is a load pulling down on the structure, and there is also a compressive load on the top element there. And so this is the minimum structure to be able to take that particular load without breaking. And we're interested in applying this type of techniques to fluid structure interaction problem. So I'll show you a couple of these problems that we worked over the past few years. The first one is on a micro-fluidic mixer, where the experimental study was done with water and glycerin, and it's a very standard kind of mixer type of design. Now, the flow is still laminar, so the whole flow is dictated by vorticity. So we can actually then look at, so because I'm slowly running out of time, I'll start skipping some of the slides and go to probably the more interesting part, where if you start with the initial design, you can drive then the solution to have in this case was so that the Buffel would not deform. And depending then on how strong or weak you do the coupling, you can get quite a different answer. In the top left-hand side, I only take the pressure load once, and I just update the structural model underneath it. While in the bottom left, I update the flow at every iteration. And it's quite obvious that the solution from just getting one pressure load is quite wrong, because there isn't the required level of symmetry. Pressure is uniform everywhere. So there should be symmetry in your answer, which is certainly what we're getting in the fully coupled solution. But the more interesting case is if you go and you actually optimizing now for the downstream vorticity and minimizing also the pressure difference. And you can see this is the start of the design that we used, and the bottom figure, the black and white, is the end design. So the flow can go through the white parts, and it's not a naturally intuitive design, but once you think about it, it starts making sense, because the flow can go through this area, and obviously no flow through the black. So you get quite a nice change in pressure that will cause that vorticity to occur. And you can see the start and end flow for the original design and our design, and how we can actually now improve the mixing in the downstream of these actual elements. But one of the problems we found is that we came across is that you can get quite a difference depending on whether you use CPU architecture or GPU architecture. With the GPU architecture, whether we use then single precision or double precision, it didn't make a lot of difference to the final answer. So if we take the CPU to being the truth, we can see that whether we use no constraints, we actually get a completely unfeasible answer. And we have to introduce some form of constraint to actually start getting something close, but is not as good as the original CPU answer. So there is something that with the GPU and a flow solver that in this type of coupling that doesn't quite work very well. And there needs to be kind of a little bit more input probably in the definition of the single and double precision in the GPU coding. Now, a second problem I wanted to introduce you, that now it has an extra problem of having temperature in there, is on transpiration cooling. So transpiration cooling is kind of a nice technique to try and improve the efficiency of a combustion, where we've got cool air that being drawn from the outside. And as long as your lining of your combustion chamber is porous, it will get drawn through the porous material, and it will create a nice coolant layer around the structure, so you can run the inner part at a much higher temperature. So to do this, we had to come up with a good initial model to make sure that we're capturing the boundary layer behavior. And some of the folks in Stuttgart University have the facility to run this experiment, which is basically just a tube with a porous layer and a coolant reservoir. And we tried two different types of setup, a monolithic setup and a two-domain setup, where the reservoir is completely decoupled from the main part of the domain of the flow. And there has to be some form of iteration going back and forth to match the boundary condition. And as you would expect, the monolithic did not solve the problem at all well, while the two-domain worked quite well. And you can see here that for different blowing ratios and temperatures of the wall, we were actually able to capture quite well the growth of the boundary layer downstream of the porous layer. But even that was not quite good enough, and we actually had to go to a three-domain solver where we solve the coolant reservoir, the hot channel, and we pass continuously in between to our solid and porous sample of the combustion chamber liner, the solution. And for each time step, we have to get a convergence to this before we can slowly converge the solution. And in all this, we also have the iteration with the structure, because what we're doing is defining what is the required level of porosity in our sample to have the best coolant layer downstream and reduce the overall temperature on our combustion liner. And when you do that, if you look by applying this, we can actually drop the temperature by just over 400 kelvins on the combustion chamber if a material distribution of this type, so black is material and white is zero material, then you would be able to have the optimal performance of having the coolant flow passing through and reducing this maximum temperature. Now, this type of designs we've also applied to the simple problems of Flutter, where we wanted to increase just the Flutter speed by design. And we applied it to simple flat plate because it's something we can do in the tunnel, so that we validated this experimentally. But we've also done it on large scale structure where there is that this is hopefully this will be tested at the Langley tunnel whenever it goes back up and running, where we wanted to add the minimum amount of mass while maintaining all the fluid properties that would dictate where a flatter speed would actually occur. So, okay, so just to conclude, so I just showed you some of the work that kind of I've been doing with some of my students, looking at some kind of, in a way, more fluid problem with the transonic buffet and the cavity flow, and something a little bit probably more oddball for you here, looking kind of more on the structural side, but that you can apply a lot of these problems in a fluid structure interaction problem, where you can actually start to manipulate the fluid to try and achieve non-conventional design in whatever kind of system you're actually interested in developing. And so with that, I would like to thank kind of all my PhD students and some of the undergraduates that have actually done a lot of this work, and obviously kind of some of my funding partners that have supported this work. So with that, I think I'll open the floor to questions if there is anything. Okay, question.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Gareth. Does anyone have any questions for Gareth? I've got a couple, if maybe while other people are collecting their thoughts, a couple of short ones, hopefully. With regards to the radial basis function stuff, I'm assuming you're using the RBFs just for the solid phase and the fluids and the solid fluid interaction, but not for the fluid phase. Is that correct?
At the moment, yes. Although we are developing a radial basis function solver to be able to couple with these elements to do the mesh motion, where we're nearly close to almost have a monolithic solver that bypasses a lot of the standard monolithic solver problems that become very problem dependent.
So in that case, sorry, in that case, the RBFs will be used for the fluid phase as well, right?
Yes.
So would you need different RBFs or staggered RBFs in order to handle the velocity and pressure?
So the two are in some way kind of decoupled, but you can make use of some of the direct information from the basis function of the fluid solver to automatically provide the information required for the deformation. So there isn't a one-to-one requirement of what the fluid solver does and what the fluid motion does. That you can almost decouple them, but you can use the information between the two.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there are computational modes associated with collocating pressures and velocities on radial basis functions, or whether you need to kind of
no,
reduce
not really.
directly.
Not that we've seen up to now.
Okay.
We're still cracking the last few elements on how to make the complete best use of just the fluid solver information with the coupling part.
Cool. I might yield my other question because Rahul has a question. Would you like to go ahead, Rahul?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So a nice presentation, Dr. Gareth. So I have few questions regarding transonic buffet. I went through few of the literature of transonic buffet that came out around 2017 around, although I have not worked on it. So I have few doubts. So like, which Mach number regime and which Reynolds number regime these results of what you are showing is correspond to?
So the Mach number, they're all in the transonic region.
Can you go back to the slides like from page 9 to 13?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
So the Reynolds number is at 10 million. And the Mach number you can vary it from around 0.5 at very large angle of attack, but then it becomes probably more of a stalled behavior. It becomes a little bit blurry. And you can get it all the way up to around 0.8.
Yeah, okay.
That at least we've seen with this aerofoil. But
Okay,
this
okay.
behavior is kind of very aerofoil dependent.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Usually I have seen in literature, it's around Mach 0.7 to 0.85 or 0.82 around they carry out this kind of experiments.
Yes, there's a sweet spot that somehow almost every solver will give a buffet, even though it's probably wrong. Certainly all this work was done with ANSYS, and it does require some tweaks to some of the stress models, parameters, to have some confidence that you're actually replicating the physics rather than having numerical aberrations. Because I think there's a sweet spot of Mach 0.72, a 3.25 degrees angle of attack where everything looks like buffet.
Okay. So, and what turbulence model you have used here?
We actually looked at almost all of them to see which one works best. Generally, the SST model does very well, and the Reynolds stress model as well. The others are really not very good. But saying that, some of them will also, you will also need to change whether using a pressure gradient or a density gradient solver to actually get it to work. And there is no understanding of why is that and which one to use under which condition.
So you have validated with the already existing literatures like the some amount of buffet boundary have been reported in the literature, like at this particular Mach numbers and at this particular angle of attack it usually happens.
Yeah, so the OAT 15 aerofoil is kind of the standard kind of aerofoil you would want to go, because Honora has done a lot of testing and all the data is out there to be able to match against. The difficult one is the thin one, because it's more related to military platforms. So if there is data, the military won't release it. And so it's we've applied the same techniques, but there is no guarantee that what we're seeing is actually true physics or not.
Okay. So another question is that, so have you published any work from the results you have shown yet?
Yes, there's a couple of papers in the Aerospace Science and Technology journal.
Okay.
So the student is now writing another 3 or 4 papers because he only recently completed his PhD.
Okay.
And if anyone wants a postdoc, he's he's looking for a job.
Okay.
So some of it is coming as well. So he's also written a literature review that is published in Progress of Aerospace Sciences.
Yeah, so I have final 2 questions. That is, you have reported, I think in page 9 or 14, about the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability and von Karman shading in Buffet, transonic Buffet. So I think this kind of analysis, I haven't found any literature in transonic Buffet from the aeroelasticity point of view. So is it your new findings, like to look into it from this Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities and von Karman shading? At what Mach number this kind of things happens?
So you can see from the screen all in there at the moment, you can see where the high incidence shock Buffet and the bimodal that you would get those type of behavior. And so these basic results of where this occur is published in one of the Aerospace Science and Technology paper.
Cool.
The kind of the structural dynamics analysis of it is the papers that are kind of in the process of being written up.
Okay.
But some of it you probably find them in the SciTech conference as well over the past couple of years.
Okay, cool. And final questions I have, that is, how did you apply DMD for the linear stability analysis? Like few of that Gao and 2017 JFM paper I once found, so they applied some kind of ERA, eigen system realization algorithms.
Yeah.
So they produced a linear system for the aeroelasticity, and from that linear system they produced which modes actually goes unstable, and from them that they computed whether it is resonance or actually Buffet. So, but DMD is basically it gives a linear approximation, but so how did you apply it? That's my question. Means like it can, I cannot see it can replace the ERA. Means like, did you apply it over the complete aeroelastic snapshots, or?
So just to the response. So it is the full aeroelastic response. Yes.
And then you apply DMD over it.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Okay, I'll have a look at your papers. Very nice works. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, feel free to email me if you want more information.
Sure. That's thanks.
Did anyone else have any questions for Gareth?
I have a question for Gareth.
Yeah, go Sean.
Gareth, I have a question about your higher order DMD slide. I'm sorry, I don't remember which number it was. So I didn't quite follow this part. Yes, here it is.
Yeah.
Can you just briefly describe what higher order DMD is, and then sort of re-explain for me the significance of the stability of the fluid versus structure modes?
So DMD, it's like Raul was saying, is not that different from an ERA. Really, it's a singular value decomposition. The higher order is where you basically repeat the response with a time delay. So you're still linearizing the system, and you're just getting a localized snapshot of your frequency and damping of your data. But from that, you can make a distinction between the structural mode and the fluid modes. And from looking at which one they are, you can start looking. So the blue circles are your fluid modes, and the red crosses are your structural mode. So because here you're basically, the pitch stiffness is just being driven by, if you want, like if it was a type A oscillation, you just got basically a sinusoidal oscillation. So the structure is kind of nice and stable in this case, but the flow being just a shock wave it's just a sinusoid, so it's basically as near zero damping. But as you change that the driving frequency, the shock wave oscillation start getting closer to your pitch stiffness oscillation. So the two starting to lock into each other. And you get now in this region 2, where the structure and the flow kind of are one on each other, and is not really, you cannot really say which one is which, and there's basically a switch between the two, or which one dominates the response and which one doesn't. As you go into the full lock-in mode, the fluid behavior are actually the ones that are now fully stable, and the structure has actually now become unstable. But obviously the overall response is stable, so that we know that the two will be kind of out of phase from each other to be able to counteract. So the structure basically tries, so the wing tries to pitch up, and the shock waves is starting its downwards travel, so it's creating your pitch downwards motion to keep it as a nice and stable oscillation. And as you go away, then just the two become again the driving frequency just doesn't make any major difference, and the two the flow goes back to being stable, and the structure is as well. But we've got kind of this increase in the actual response from the structural modes, while the fluids actually remain constant.
Thanks. That's very clear for me.
Yeah, sorry, I went a little bit quick because
yeah,
I was seeing that I was running.
No worries. The physical picture really cleared it up for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions for Gareth? So it's 5 o'clock. Do you think we should wrap things up, Sean?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much to Gareth once again for speaking to us. That was a really enjoyable talk that covered a lot of subject matter.
My pleasure. Hopefully there was of interest.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you all. So we're back to the Wednesday time for next week. So hopefully we'll see you all on next Wednesday.